tonight we pull the covers up to our chin, not in a quiet suburb, but in a world without locks. Not the flimsy kind you forget the code to, but a world without the very idea of a lock. You're not lying in a bed, but on a hardened dirt floor, the smell of a banked hearth fire and cold night soil thick in the air. The dark outside your shelter isn't just an absence of light, it's a physical presence. It's the crawl of things with too many legs, the rustle of predators whose eyes gleam with a hunger you understand all too well, and the whisper of shapes that might not be made of flesh at all. Your door, if you can even call it that, is a stretch of hide, a woven mat, a few lashed together branches. It marks a boundary, yes. But it is a suggestion, not a statement. A hope, not a guarantee. To survive here, you need more than a barrier. You need a sentinel. This, right here in the primal knot of fear and hope in your gut, is where our story begins. It is the first, universal human prayer. Let this thin line between my warmth and the cold, wide world hold. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. That impulse, to define an inside and an outside, is older than writing, older than cities, older than the wheel. The mainstream historical fact we often forget is that the concept of private property, of a space that is inviolably yours, is one of the foundations of civilization itself. And you can't have private property without a way to mark it and defend it. Archaeologists find evidence of this primal need everywhere. Post holes that outline a dwelling far more permanent than a tent, stone foundations that say this space is claimed, and the remnants of palisade walls that turned a whole village into a single, giant home with one collective door. The door, then, becomes the ultimate point of vulnerability. It's the necessary breach in your own defenses. It's the place where you must welcome friends, food, and firewood, but it is also the chink through which every threat, real or imagined, will try to pour. You probably won't survive this, not back then, with your modern sensibilities and your reliance on central heating and alarm systems. Your nervous system, tuned to the ping of a text message, would be shattered by the symphony of the ancient night. Every snap of a twig would be a crisis. Every shift of the wind would carry a potential message. In this state of hypervigilance, the physical door is never enough. It's just wood and straw. What you need is a layer of protection that exists in the mind, in the spirit. You need to believe your threshold is watched by something stronger than you. Long before fierce generals with funny mustaches were pasted to gates, people used what they had. And in many cultures, that meant dung. Specifically, the dung of powerful or terrifying animals. Smearing lion or crocodile waste near an entrance was a common apotropaic practice, a fancy word for magic aimed at turning away evil. The logic was beautifully direct and slightly disgusting. The lingering scent of the most fearsome creature in the valley would convince lesser spirits and prowlers that this was its territory. Move along, the stench said. Nothing to eat here but a much bigger predator's leftovers. It was a primal, stinky first draft of a beware of dog sign. Historians still argue whether these practices sprang from a unified, proto-religious impulse across humanity or were simply the same brilliant, terrified idea occurring to different people staring into the same terrifying dark. Did a mother in ancient Mesopotamia and a father in the Yellow River Valley, separated by continents, both look at their sleeping children and then at the flimsy door, and arrive at the same conclusion: this needs a ghost? The evidence suggests they might have. The need to sanctify and guard the threshold appears to be a human universal, as fundamental as the need for the roof itself. So you lie there, in our imagined ancient night, your ears straining. The hide flap over your doorway stares. Is it just the wind? Or is it the reason you spent all afternoon carefully daubing that rancid paste onto the lintel? Your mind, seeking a shape for its fear, begins to paint one in the darkness. It starts not with a man, but with a force. A presence. Something that doesn't sleep. This mental act, this conjuring of a guardian from the raw materials of dread and hope, is the true birthplace of the door god. You are no longer just a person in a hut. You are a commander of invisible forces, posting the first watch on the most important border you will ever know, the one between your fragile peace and the endless, hungry unknown. The sentinel is born in your mind. The next step is to give it a face, a name, and a very specific piece of real estate to defend. That mental sentinel, the guardian you conjured from fear, couldn't stay formless forever. The human mind craves symbols, tangible focuses for its intangible hopes. And in the fertile river valleys of early China, that symbol wasn't found in the guise of a man or a beast, but in a tree. Not just any tree, but the Tao tree, the peach. Now, you're probably thinking of fuzzy fruit, sweet pies, maybe a Bellini if you're feeling fancy. But forget all that. In the world we're drifting into, the peach tree was the closest thing to a supernatural hardware store. Its wood was considered inherently hostile to the spirit world, a kind of spiritual radiation that repelled ghosts and malignant forces. Imagine this. You're not just a peasant anymore, you're a ritual specialist, a proto-daoist maybe, in the Shang or early Zhou dynasty. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this is the existence of the Taofu, or peachwood charm. Texts like the Classic of Mountains and Seas, a wild compendium of mythic geography, describe a giant peach tree on Dushuo Mountain. Its branches stretched over a magical gate, the Ghost Gate, through which all the world's evil spirits passed. Two deities, whom we'll meet properly very soon, administered justice to these spirits there. But the key takeaway for an anxious homeowner was this: the wood from this cosmic tree had power. So, you'd take 2 slats of peachwood, maybe a couple of feet long. You wouldn't carve a person on them. Instead, you'd inscribe them with the names or crude images of those 2 gatekeeping gods, Shinto and Yulu. Then you'd tie them together with a reed rope and hang them on your door. This was your first line of defense. A DIY ghost deterrent kit. The logic was beautifully simple and a little bit like installing a security system that works by loudly announcing the security company's name. The peachwood itself was the repellent. Ghosts were said to hate its essence. The inscribed names were the authority, a direct citation of the spiritual world's most notorious bouncers. And the reed rope? That was the barrier, a symbolic sealing of your domestic space. You weren't asking for a guardian to stand watch. You were posting a legally binding, supernatural no trespassing sign, written in the official language of the spirit bureaucracy. It wasn't just the wood. Every part of the peach tree was a weapon in the ancient Chinese war on spooks. Peachwood boughs were used in exorcism rituals to shoot invisible arrows at malignant influences. Peachwood arrows were stuck into the ground around graves to pin down any restless spirits thinking of a homecoming visit. But the real fringe weapon was the peach pit. Specifically, the kernels inside. They were gathered, pulverized, and mixed into, well, medicines. The idea was that ingesting a bit of this ghost-repelling material would fortify your own body's defenses against spiritual pathogens. It was like eating your security system. Historians still argue whether this was primarily magical thinking or an early, misunderstood form of herbal medicine, as peach kernels do have trace amounts of compounds that can affect the body. Either way, it shows how thoroughly the peach equals protection idea was baked into the culture. Your door wasn't just guarded, your whole body could be, from the inside out. So picture your home now, maybe 1,000 years before the Common Era. It's more substantial than a hide hut, a rammed earth foundation, wooden pillars, a thatched roof. And on your wooden door, which, let's be honest, a determined wall for a bored neighbor could probably get through, are these 2 slats of peachwood. They don't look like much. just some carved sticks. But to you, and to everyone who passes by, they speak an entire volume of protective law. They tell the night, this house operates under the jurisdiction of Dushuo Mountain. All spectral entities must present themselves for judgment at the Ghost Gate and are not permitted to linger here. It's bureaucracy as a spiritual force field. This is a quieter, more elegant kind of magic than the dung smearing of other cultures. It's less about mimicking a predator's stench and more about invoking cosmic authority. It turns your threshold into a branch office of the afterlife's judiciary. But as effective as it was, it had a limitation. It was abstract. The names Shinto and Yulu were powerful, but they were just words on wood. They lacked personality. They lacked a face you could imagine standing firm in a storm, a scowl that could wither a demon at 20 paces. The human heart, in its need for comfort, wants a hero, not a statue. It was only a matter of time before a story came along, a really good, terrifying, imperial-grade story, that would force those names off the peachwood and into the vivid, colorful, and very muscular forms of two extremely stressed-out generals. The age of the symbol was about to give way to the age of the soldier. But for now, the peachwood holds the line, its silent, vegetative power humming against the dark, a testament to humanity's brilliant, desperate knack for finding guardians in the most unexpected of places, even in the heart of a piece of fruit. Those names on the peachwood, Shinto and Yulu, weren't just random words pulled from the spirit world directory. They had a backstory, a mythology as wild and primal as the earliest fears they were meant to quell. To understand the gravity of their names on your door, you have to journey past the boundaries of the historical and into the realm of pure myth, to the very dawn of order itself. According to texts like the classic of Mountains and Seas, the world after its creation was a mess. A beautiful, chaotic, dangerous mess. And among the many problems faced by the legendary Yellow Emperor Huangdi was a ghost problem. Not just a few pesky spooks, but a full-blown spectral immigration crisis. Ghosts were wandering everywhere, causing sickness, nightmares, and general supernatural mischief. They needed management. They needed a border checkpoint. So the Yellow Emperor, in his divine administrative wisdom, identified the bottleneck. All these spirits were emerging from a specific place in the far northeast. A metaphysical tear in reality called the Ghost Gate, on the slopes of that same Dushuo mountain with the giant peach tree. He needed a permanent, incorruptible security detail to staff it. His choices for this thankless job were two brothers, Shinto and Yulu. Now, the mainstream historical fact nestled in this myth is the ancient Chinese concept of a structured spirit world that mirrors and interacts with the human bureaucracy. The afterlife had officials, jurisdictions, and paperwork long before it had pearly gates or fiery pits. Shinto and Yulu were appointed as the first and most important border guards in this system. But what made them qualified? The myths are fuzzy, but the implications are clear. They were undoubtedly powerful, loyal, and terrifying enough to make a ghost think twice. Some stories suggest they were themselves powerful spirits or demigods. Others hint they might have been fearsome tribal chieftains in life, their reputations for ferocity carrying over into death, earning them this promotion. Their job description was simple but immense. Stand at the Ghost Gate, inspect every spirit that passed through, and subdue any that were causing trouble. Their tools? The peachwood branches from the great tree and reed ropes to bind the unruly. If a ghost was deemed particularly malicious, the brothers were authorized to feed it to a tiger. A divine tiger that waited beside the gate for just such occasions. The ultimate deterrent wasn't just imprisonment or banishment, but being served as a cosmic tiger snack. It added a deliciously final layer to divine justice. So when you inscribed Shinto and Yulu on your peachwood slats, you weren't just naming abstract powers. You were doing something far more clever. You were invoking jurisdiction. You were creating a symbolic link between your humble door and the primary bottleneck of the spirit world. You were essentially declaring, by the authority vested in the peach tree of Dushua Mountain and its appointed guards, all spirits approaching this portal are hereby subject to inspection and binding under penalty of tiger-based consumption. It was a brilliant legalistic hack. You couldn't have the brothers themselves at your door. They had a whole cosmic gate to run. But you could cite their supreme authority and tap into the protective resonance of their domain. Historians still argue whether Shinto and Yulu were ever worshipped as independent gods outside of this door-guarding context, or if their entire divine portfolio was ghost gate management. The evidence suggests the latter. They are almost exclusively the gods of the threshold, of the boundary. They have no temples for abundant harvests, no cults for healing the sick. Their purview is singular. The line between here and there, safe and unsafe, ordered and chaotic. They are the spiritual equivalent of a dedicated firewall. Highly specialized, brutally effective, and with no user-friendly features whatsoever. Imagine the confidence this mythic link gave you. The wind howls sounding like a whale. A floorboard creaks without cause. Instead of sheer panic, you could now feel a thread of connection. Your door was an outpost. The fear you felt was just a faint echo of the terror every ghost felt approaching the brothers and their tiger at the Real Gate. Your home was under the same protective umbrella as the cosmos itself. This was the power of the myth. It scaled. It could protect an emperor's palace or a fisherman's hut using the same principle, because it wasn't about the size of the building, but the sanctity of the boundary. But myths, for all their power, are remote. They speak of emperors and cosmic gates. What happens when the threat isn't a generic ghost from a mountain, but something more personal? What happens when the emperor himself, the son of heaven, the one supposed to be most protected by heaven's mandate, is the one lying awake, haunted not by abstract spirits, but by the very specific dripping ghosts of his own questionable decisions? The story was about to pivot from mythic administrators to a deeply human drama of guilt, power, and two very loyal, very tired bodyguards. The guardians were about to step off the peachwood and into the palace hallway, because the most powerful man in the world couldn't get a good night's sleep. The myth of Shinto and Yulu provided a cosmic blueprint, but it took a mortal emperor's very personal terror to bring the door god down to earth and give him a face you'd recognize in a crowd. Fast forward from the mists of high myth to the solid, glorious, and often brutally pragmatic Tang dynasty. The year is the 7th century, and the man on the most powerful throne in the world is Emperor Taizong. He's a titan of history, a brilliant strategist, a patron of the arts, the emperor who solidified one of China's golden ages. The mainstream historical fact is his reign, the Zhenguan era, is legendary for its stability, prosperity, and relatively just administration. But history, especially official history, likes its heroes clean. The unofficial stories whispered in lantern-lit alleyways tell a different, more human tale. The problem was sleep. Or rather, the lack of it. After consolidating his power, a process that, like founding any dynasty, involved a fair amount of what we'll euphemistically call kinetic political restructuring, Taizong began to be plagued by nightmares. Not vague shadows, but visceral, terrifying visitations. The stories say he was haunted by the ghosts of his slain brothers, whom he had killed in the coup that brought him to the throne, and by the wailing spirits of soldiers who had died in his campaigns. They would gather outside his palace bedchamber, rattling the tiles, moaning in the drains, turning every night into a siege of guilt. The imperial physicians were useless. Priests and Daoist masters performed rituals, but the ghosts were persistent, personal, and politically inconvenient. An emperor who can't sleep is an emperor who can't rule, and the mandate of heaven itself might seem to be slipping. Taizong, exhausted and desperate, mentioned his plight to his trusted ministers. One of them, the clever Wei Zheng, a historical figure famed as a fearless advisor, supposedly suggested a logical, martial solution. If spiritual guards weren't working, why not try the real thing? The emperor had two of the most fearsome generals in his army, Qin Shubao and Yu Qigong. These were not bureaucrats or philosophers. They were mountains of men who had fought their way to the top in a brutal civil war. Their faces were maps of battle scars, their reputations were enough to silence a tavern brawl, and their loyalty to Taizong was absolute. Wei Zheng proposed, post them on guard duty. Not just outside the palace complex, but right outside the royal bedchamber door, in full battle armor, weapons in hand. So, picture the scene. The most powerful man in the known world, wrapped in silk blankets, and outside his door, two living legends stand like wrathful statues. Qin Shubao, with his fierce demeanor, and Yu Qigong, often depicted with a dark, almost supernatural complexion, a useful trait for scaring off creatures of the night. They stand there all night, every night. And the story goes, it worked. The ghosts, faced with this level of tangible, fierce, human determination, bottled up their grievances and left. Taizong slept. But here's the practical problem historians still argue about. You can't have your two top generals pulling all-nighters as glorified night watchmen forever. They have armies to train, borders to secure, rebellions to crush. The empire needs them awake during the day. So, the legend continues, a compromise was found. The emperor ordered court painters to create life-size portraits of the two generals in their full, terrifying regalia. These portraits were then pasted onto the two panels of his bedchamber doors. The theory was that the image of their ferocity, their likeness, would carry the same deterrent effect as their physical presence. It was a stopgap measure born of imperial insomnia and administrative necessity. And according to the law, it worked just as well. The ghosts saw the painted scowls, the ready weapons, and decided the emperor's conscience was, for now, a fortress too tough to haunt. This moment is the great pivot. It moved the concept of door protection from the abstract, peachwood, mythical names, to the representational, a painted image of a specific, known hero. It tied the practice to a relatable human story of fear, loyalty, and a clever workaround. It also secularized it, just a bit. The power wasn't solely in a god's name anymore. It was in the captured essence of a human's formidable spirit and reputation. Taizong, relieved, could now sleep. But he had, completely unintentionally, just launched a cultural product that would fly far beyond the palace walls. The idea was too good, too psychologically satisfying, to remain an imperial secret. Soon, everyone wanted a piece of that piece. And when an emperor's hack becomes public domain, the market, and the myth-making machinery, kicks into high gear. The painted generals worked. The emperor slept. And as with all things imperial in ancient China, what worked for the son of heaven quickly became the model for everyone beneath him. But you couldn't just hire Qin Shubao or Yu Qigong to stand outside your shop. Their images, however, were another matter. This is where the legend leaps from the palace and marches, in lockstep, into the heart of every home, shop, and temple in the land. The mainstream historical fact to hold on to here is the Tang dynasty's role as a massive cultural exporter. Its fashions, laws, art, and yes, its superstitions, spread along the Silk Road and down the canals, becoming the height of sophistication. Having a Tang-style door god wasn't just about protection, it was about being a la mode, about tapping into the same cosmic security that guarded the emperor himself. So, you're no longer a Tang emperor. You're a prosperous merchant in Chang'an, or a landowner in the south. You've heard the delicious gossip about the emperor's ghostly troubles and the generals who solved them. The story has everything: royal drama, ghostly vengeance, heroic loyalty, and a clever, artistic fix. It's the perfect myth for a practical, ambitious culture. You want that security. You want that imperial connection. You commission a painter, not a court artist, but a local one, to paint your door gods. The instructions are specific. They must be recognizably Qin Shubao and Yu Qigong. Qin is often painted with a paler complexion, wielding a pair of golden jian swords, his expression stern and authoritative. Yu Qigong, with his famously dark face, is depicted brandishing a steel mace or a spear, his eyes bulging with ferocity. They are always in pairs, always facing each other, creating a dynamic tension across your door frame, as if caught in a perpetual, vigilant standoff against the unseen world. But how did two flesh and blood men, who breathed, ate, and likely complained about their knees aching after a long campaign, transform into invincible spiritual guardians? The legends around the generals themselves began to inflate, absorbing older myths to explain their new divine day jobs. One popular story says they weren't just brave, they were preordained for this. In a previous life, they were said to have been ministers in heaven who volunteered to be reborn as mortal generals to help the true emperor, Taizong, pacify the world. Having completed their earthly mission, their spiritual essence was naturally suited to guard the boundary between realms. Another tale whispers that Yu Qigong's dark face wasn't just from the sun. It was because he was part demon or had a naturally occurring spiritual darkness that scared evil spirits even more effectively. They were being retrofitted with mythical backstories to justify their new, full-time spiritual occupation. Historians still argue whether the popular adoption of Qin and Yu Qi was a top-down process, encouraged by the state to promote loyalty and imperial imagery, or a bottom-up phenomenon of folk culture seizing a great story and running with it. The truth is likely a messy blend. The state certainly didn't discourage it, having your two most loyal generals symbolically guarding every door in the empire is fantastic propaganda. But the people embraced it because it made sense. These were heroes whose power they understood: martial prowess, unwavering loyalty, a physical presence that commanded respect. They were more relatable than the distant, bureaucratic Shintu and Yulu. You could imagine these guys actually fighting for you. Now your door isn't just a plank of wood with some magic words. It's a stage. On the left panel, General Qin Shubao, the strategist, the authority figure. On the right, General Yu Qigong, the enforcer, the raw power. Together, they represent a complete defense system: brain and brawn, law and order, the dignified warning and the violent consequence. Every time you slip through your door, you pass between them. You are, for a moment, the emperor in his bedchamber, flanked by his most loyal protectors. It's a daily, visceral dose of psychological security. The story of the haunted emperor gave people permission to anthropomorphize their protection, to choose guardians with biographies, with character, with faces that told a story of victory. The door god was no longer a charm, he was a comrade in arms. And as this new tradition took root, it created a vacuum cleaner effect on culture, sucking in other worthy candidates, other stories of power and protection, waiting for their chance to stand guard. The door was open for business, and there were many heroes, and one spectacularly failed scholar, vying for a spot. 4 generations, the fierce visages of Qin Shubao and Yu Qigong remained the gold standard, but they had a significant limitation: they were a luxury good. Commissioning a skilled painter to create a unique, lifelike portrait for your door was expensive. It was artisanal, time-consuming, and therefore mostly for the wealthy, the merchant classes, the landed gentry, the important temples. For the vast majority of people, the farmers, the tradesmen, the families in cramped city lanes, divine protection was still an abstract concept, locked away on peachwood plaques or in stories they couldn't afford to illustrate. The door god tradition was potent, but it wasn't yet democratic. Then, a technological revolution arrived, not with a bang, but with the quiet, repetitive thump of a woodblock on paper. Welcome to the age of mass-produced divinity. The mainstream historical fact that made this possible was the perfection of woodblock printing during the Song dynasty. This wasn't a sudden invention for door gods. It was a technology that had been brewing for centuries, used for printing textiles and Buddhist scriptures. But in the commercially vibrant, popular Song era, some brilliant, anonymous entrepreneur, had the idea to apply it to folk religion. The process was simple and ingenious. A skilled carver would take a block of fine-grained wood, usually pear or jujube, and carve the mirror image of a door god design into it, one block for each color used. This was a massive upfront investment of labor. But once the block was made, it could be used to print thousands of nearly identical images. Ink was applied, paper pressed down, and thump, out came a guardian, ready for duty, for a fraction of the cost of a painting. This changed everything. Suddenly, divine protection was a purchasable commodity. As Lunar New Year approached, markets would be flooded with these Nianhua, New Year prints. Vendors would set up stalls with vibrant stacks of door gods, their colors bold and garish from cheap, fast dyes. You could browse. You could choose. You could buy a matching pair for your front door, a smaller set for your back door, maybe even a special one for the stable. The door god had gone from a bespoke suit of spiritual armor to off-the-rack security, and everyone could suit up. The prints weren't just sacred objects, they were products. They had to compete. So printers began to innovate. They added more colors. 5-color prints were a premium option. They created new compositions. The generals on horseback, the generals surrounded by symbols of good fortune, bats for luck, peaches for longevity. They even started printing helpful labels, so you didn't accidentally paste Qin Shubao on the right and Yu Qigong on the left, disrupting their cosmic symmetry. Consumer culture had met folk belief, and they were getting along famously. This explosion of supply created a feedback loop with demand. As more people bought them, the imagery became standardized, a visual shorthand instantly recognized across the culture. The fierce expressions, the specific weapons, the color schemes, all became codified through repetition. It also led to regional specialization. Certain towns, like Yangliuking near Tianjin or Taohuawu in Suzhou, became famous for their distinctive Nianhua styles, their door gods known for particular artistic flourishes. A door god from Yangliuking might be more detailed and painterly, while one from the north might be bolder and more graphic. You weren't just buying protection, you were buying a piece of regional craft, a badge of local identity. Historians still argue whether the woodblock print ultimately diluted the spiritual potency of the door god, turning a sacred guardian into a cheap poster, or whether it amplified its power by making it universally accessible. There's evidence for both. On one hand, the ritual of pasting them remained solemn. On the other, their omnipresence undoubtedly made them more familiar, less awe-inspiring. But perhaps that was the point. The door god wasn't meant to be a distant, terrifying deity. He was meant to be part of the family's annual rhythm, a familiar friend who showed up every new year to take up his post. The print made him a household staple, as routine as buying rice or mending a roof. So now, on the eve of the Lunar New Year, the ritual is within everyone's reach. You take your purchased prints, you mix your paste from flour and water, you carefully remove last year's faded, torn guardians, thankfully, their duty done, and you paste up the new, vibrant ones. The smell of the paste, the bright shock of the new colors against the weathered door, the satisfying smoothness of the paper under your palm as you press out the bubbles. It's a sensory experience of renewal. The technology of the woodblock didn't diminish the tradition. It embedded it into the very fabric of everyday life. It proved that spiritual security didn't have to be rare or expensive. It could be cheap, cheerful, and utterly dependable. And with the market now wide open, it paved the way for other, more specialized protectors to find their niche. After all, if you can print a general, why not a scholar, a bureaucrat, or a ghost catcher with a particularly impressive resume of failure? While Generals Qin and Yuqi represent martial valor and imperial loyalty, another figure was stalking his way onto doors, bringing a completely different kind of energy. This guardian wasn't a mountain of muscle. He was a disheveled scholar with a tragic backstory and a rage against the spirit world that made him arguably more terrifying. His name was Zhong Kuei, and he is the ultimate underdog story. A door god born from profound failure, a ghost catcher who got the job because the system failed him spectacularly. His path to your doorframe is a tale of bureaucratic injustice, supernatural vengeance, and the peculiar honor bestowed upon brilliant, ugly outsiders. The mainstream historical backdrop here is the imperial examination system, the grueling, multi-day tests that, in theory, allowed any talented scholar, regardless of birth, to win a prestigious government post and bring honor to his family. It was the engine of social mobility and the source of immense pressure. Zhong Kuei's legend begins with him as a scholar of exceptional intellect and learning, traveling to the capital to take the highest exam, the Jinsha. He aced it. He came in first. He was, by all academic metrics, the top candidate in the empire. There was just one problem: his face. The stories describe him as frightfully ugly, bulging eyes, a wild beard, a face that looked like it had been carved from a cliff by a careless giant. When he was presented to the emperor for the final approval, the monarch, allegedly Emperor Xuanzong of Tang, took one look at him and recoiled. The emperor deemed his appearance unbefitting of a top graduate and stripped him of his first-place title on the spot. Humiliated and enraged by this shallow injustice, Zhong Kuei, in a fit of despair, committed suicide on the palace steps, dashing his head against the marble. The story doesn't end there. That night, the now ghost of Zhong Kuei appeared in the sleeping emperor's dream. But he wasn't there for vengeance. Dressed in the robes of a scholar, but now with the terrifying mien of a powerful ghost, he proclaimed that since he had been wronged by the earthly bureaucracy, he would dedicate his afterlife to a new mission: hunting down and devouring the malicious ghosts and demons that plague the world. He would be the empire's ghost catcher. To prove his sincerity and power, he proceeded to single-handedly catch and eat a small demon that had been troubling the emperor. When Xuanzong woke, he was both terrified and impressed. He ordered the court painter Wu Daozi, a legendary historical artist, to paint a portrait of Zhong Kuei based on the dream. This image, depicting the scholar in fierce, demon-quelling action, was then circulated and, you guessed it, pasted on doors as a protective talisman. Zhong Kuei's appeal is profound and complex. He's the patron saint of all who feel cheated by the system, the brilliant mind rejected for superficial reasons. His power comes not from official appointment, but from personal, righteous fury. He's an anti-bureaucrat, policing the spirit world because the human one was so unfair. As a door god, he often appears alone, not in a pair, a lone wolf enforcer. He's depicted in dynamic, violent poses, stabbing a demon with a sword, tearing one apart with his bare hands, or trampling it underfoot. He is chaos and vengeance harnessed and pointed squarely at evil. Historians still argue whether the Zhong Kuei myth originated as a political allegory criticizing corrupt or shallow officials, or as a folk explanation for pre-existing exorcism rituals that used frightening masks. His legend seems to absorb older shamanic traditions of fierce, demonifugic figures. But his lasting power is in his humanity. His flawed, wronged, emotional. You can pity him, fear him, and root for him all at once. For a family, pasting Zhong Kuei on the door wasn't just about hiring a bouncer. It was about aligning yourself with a principled, if terrifying, force of retributive justice. He was proof that even failure, if it was grand and unjust enough, could be forged into a weapon to protect others. So now, the door god pantheon had expanded. You had a choice. Did you want the official, imperial strength of Qin and Yuqi, the establishment gods? Or did you want the fierce, independent justice of Zhong Kuei, the revolutionary ghost catcher? His presence on a door sent a different message. This house is protected not by the emperor's generals, but by the wrath of a scholar who knows exactly how unfair the universe can be, and has made it his personal mission to balance the scales. It was a powerful, comforting thought, especially for those who felt the system was stacked against them. The door was becoming a bulletin board for different philosophies of protection, and the next logical step was to realize that you didn't have to choose just one. You could, in fact, have it all. With Zhong Kuei crashing the party, the door was no longer a simple posting for a single type of guardian. It had become a curated space, a strategic display of spiritual defense. And like any good defense, it required balance, specialization, and clear rules of engagement. This is where we move from collecting cool characters to understanding the deep, almost architectural logic behind how they were paired and placed. It wasn't random. Sticking two fierce warriors on your door was like mounting two cannons on your porch. Effective but blunt. The ancient Chinese worldview sought harmony, the balance of complementary opposites, yin and yang. Your door defense needed to reflect that. This leads us to the mainstream historical concept of Wen and Wu, the civil and the martial. These are the two fundamental pillars of statecraft and, by extension, of a well-ordered life and home. Wu is what we've seen so far. Martial prowess, raw power, the force that subdues chaos. Qin Shubao, Yuqi Gong, and Zhong Kuei, in his own violent way, are Wu. They are the shield, the sword, the snarling guard dog. But Wen is different. It is civil virtue, administrative wisdom, cultural refinement, the power that attracts blessings and governs through harmony. A complete household needed both. It needed to repel evil, yes, but it also needed to actively invite good fortune, prosperity, scholarly success, and longevity. So, the door god system evolved to provide this balanced defense. The most classic pairing became the civil and martial door gods. On one side of the door, you'd have a Wu god like one of our fierce generals. On the other you'd have a Wen god. These were often depicted as serene, bearded officials in court robes. They might be holding symbols of civil authority, a ritual scepter, rui, a scroll of office, or a tablet. Sometimes they were specific historical figures known for their wisdom and virtue, like the great minister Wei Xing, the same one who suggested the live guards, or Fu Xing, a scholar famed for memorizing and preserving the Confucian classics during a book-burning era. The message was clear. This household is defended by the fist and the mind, by the power to destroy threats and the wisdom to cultivate peace. In traditional Chinese orientation, left is east, the direction of the rising sun, and is considered the superior yang position. Right is west, the setting sun, and is yin. When facing the door from outside, the left panel, east/yang, was typically reserved for the civil god. The right panel, west/yin, was for the martial god. Why? Because the civil, attracting force of Wen was associated with the creative, ascending energy of yang. The martial, repelling force of Wu was associated with the protective, descending energy of yin. Getting this wrong wasn't just aesthetically displeasing. It was like wiring your security system backwards. It could theoretically misfire, attracting what you meant to repel and vice versa. Printers often marked the backs of the prints with tiny characters, left and right, to prevent this domestic spiritual disaster. Historians still argue whether this strict left civil right-martial pairing was universally observed or a later formalized ideal that simpler folk might ignore. In practice, many households, especially those of modest means, might just use a matched pair of martial gods for simplicity and raw protective power. But the ideal of the balanced pair reflects a profound cultural truth. Security wasn't just about keeping bad things out. It was about creating the right conditions for good things to flourish inside. A door defended only by violence was a door to a fortress. A door guarded by both wisdom and strength was a door to a home. This logic of pairing extended further. Some doors featured two civil officials, for households prioritizing scholarly or bureaucratic success. Others featured two martial gods, for families in risky trades or living in particularly unclean areas. There were even pairs of door gods representing specific blessings, gods of wealth, gods of longevity, their pairing designed to create a synergistic effect, doubling down on a particular kind of fortune. The door became a statement of intent, a family's spiritual business card. Are we a military family? Scholarly clan? A mercantile house desperate for good luck? Look at our door. The guardians will tell you. And as you walk through that door every day, passing between these balanced forces, you are subtly reminded of the ideals you are meant to uphold. To be both strong and wise, both protective and prosperous. The guardians aren't just watching the outside world. They're modeling the harmony you're supposed to cultivate within. The front door, with its balanced pair of civil and martial sentinels, was the public face of your household's spiritual defense. But a home, especially a prosperous one, was more than a single entrance. It was a complex of spaces, each with its own vulnerabilities and sacred purposes. The ancient Chinese worldview saw spiritual pollution and malevolent forces as opportunistic, seeking any point of ingress. A fortress is only as strong as its weakest gate, and so the logic of the door god had to scale, to specialize, to become a complete security detail for your entire domestic universe. This meant posting guards at every portal that mattered. Behind the main residence, often tucked away for privacy and practicality, was the kitchen. Its door was a vital checkpoint. Here, the threat wasn't just generic evil spirits. It was the specific danger of contaminating the family's sustenance. The god of the kitchen hearth, Zhao Wangye, the kitchen god, is famous, but he was an insider, reporting to heaven on your family's conduct. The door to his domain also needed protection. Sometimes a simpler, smaller print of a martial god would be used. But there was also a wonderfully specific guardian for grain stores and pantries, the rat-catcher door god. This was often a depiction of a cat, not a cute pet, but a fierce, stylized feline, sometimes with the wings of a bat for good measure, poised to pounce. Its singular mission, to repel the spirits of gluttony and waste, often symbolized by rats, from devouring your winter stores. It was pest control on a metaphysical level. Then there was the stable or livestock enclosure. In an agrarian society, your animals were your wealth, your transportation, your livelihood. They were also considered vulnerable to a particular kind of spirit, ones that caused stampedes, sickness, or mysterious wasting diseases. The stable door might get a specialized guardian, often a deified historical figure known for his skill with horses, like the Tang general Ma Chao, whose very name, Superhorse, made him an apt candidate. Or it might be a generic horse god print, depicting a serene official who ensured the animal's health and fertility. The protection here was for productivity, for the continuity of your economic engine. The back door, the secondary gate, was a fascinating case. It was less formal, used by family, servants, and for taking out rubbish. But in spiritual terms, a back door could be a liability, a less watched entrance where weaker or sneakier spirits might try to slip in. Its guardian was often a less prestigious, sometimes more mischievous figure. One common choice was the Taoist immortal and trickster, Han Xiangzi, one of the 8 immortals. He was a flute-playing, flower-summoning charmer, but his unpredictable nature was thought to confuse and misdirect evil spirits trying a back-alley approach. He wasn't a blunt instrument of force, he was a psychological operation, a spiritual mousetrap of confusion. The treasury or strong room, if you had one, presented the ultimate challenge, guarding not just safety, but literal fortune. Here, you might find door gods who were explicitly deities of wealth. The most famous pair, the civil god of wealth, Bai Gan, and the martial god of wealth, Zhao Gongming, could be promoted from altar statues to door guardians for this specific room. Zhao Gongming, often depicted on a black tiger, was particularly suited, a martial god whose specialty was attracting and guarding treasure, a divine armored truck for your cash. This was hyper-specialization, matching the guardian's divine portfolio directly to the function of the room behind the door. Historians still argue whether this network of specialized door gods was a widespread, systematic practice or a theoretical ideal followed mainly by the wealthy and devout. For a poor farmer, one print on the front door was likely the extent of it. But the principle reveals the comprehensiveness of the spiritual mindset. Every portal was a transition point, and every transition carried risk. The house was a body, and the doors were its orifices, each needing a filter to keep the bad out and the good in. During weddings, the bridal sedan chair would have protective charms or images pasted on its door. Even a coffin, the final door from one world to the next, might have a paper door god affixed to it, a guardian for the soul's final, one-way journey. So, your ancient Chinese home, in its ideal form, was a constellation of protected thresholds. From the feast generals at the formal front, to the cat on the granary, the horse whisperer on the stable, and the trickster on the back gate, you had created a tailored, layered defense in depth. It was a daily, visible reminder that prosperity and safety were holistic. You couldn't just guard your person, you had to guard your food, your wealth, your animals, your trash. Every opening to the world was a covenant, sealed by a guardian who understood the specific nature of the threat. It was an entire spiritual ecosystem, with a specialized niche for every possible danger. And at the heart of this system was an unshakable belief that the right face, in the right place, staring down the right kind of trouble, could make all the difference between a thriving household and a haunted one. Let's take a closer look at those faces. Whether it's the bulging eyes of Yu Qigong, the demon-rending snarl of Zhong Kuei, or the stylized ferocity of a guardian lion dog, one thing is consistent: they are not pretty. They are deliberately, often grotesquely, frightening. This isn't an artistic failure or a lack of skill. It's the entire point. In the ancient Chinese arsenal of spiritual defense, ugliness was a feature, not a bug. It was a calculated aesthetic of intimidation, rooted in a very old and widespread belief that which is lowly, coarse, or fearsome in this world holds power over the unseen one. To understand this, we need the mainstream historical context of apotropaic art, art designed to ward off evil. This concept is global. Think of the gargoyles on European cathedrals, the monstrous oni masks in Japanese festivals, the gorgon's head on a Greek shield. The logic is universal. Fight fire with fire, fight monsters with images of something even more monstrous. In China, this tradition ran deep. Before door gods, there were tomb guardians, fierce, mythical beasts like the Bixie or Tianlu, sculpted to look terrifying so they could scare away tomb raiders, both physical and spiritual. The door god inherited this job description. His ugliness was his resume. A beautiful, serene face might be admired by humans, but it would do nothing to give a malicious spirit pause. A face that looked like it had been on the wrong end of a century of warfare, however, spoke a language ghosts understood: violence. There was a widespread concept known as using the lowly to control the lowly. Spirits, especially the hungry, wandering ghosts that caused most household trouble, were considered base, coarse, and malicious creatures of a low order. The most effective agents to control them were therefore not the high, celestial gods, who were too busy and dignified for such petty patrols, but beings who, while powerful, were themselves of a similarly fierce, earthy, or even low nature. This is why so many door gods are not born gods, but deified humans who died violent deaths or lived violent lives: generals, failed scholars, executioners. Their spirits carried the gritty, harsh energy of the mortal world, which was exactly the toolkit needed for street-level spiritual enforcement. Their ugliness visually communicated this lowly but potent nature. It was a class statement in the spirit world. To deal with the riffraff, we've hired the toughest, meanest enforcer in the afterlife. This aesthetic extended to their posture and tools. They are rarely standing at ease. They are captured mid-action, muscles coiled, weapons raised, bodies twisted in a dynamic stance that suggests imminent, explosive violence. Their eyes are wide and staring, directly engaging whoever, or whatever, approaches. This 1,000-yard stare wasn't meant for you, the homeowner. It was meant to look past you, into the spirit-laden darkness, locking onto targets you couldn't see. Their colors are bold and contrasting: harsh blacks, vibrant reds, jarring greens. Red, in particular, was, and is, the color of life, vitality, and yang energy, inherently hostile to the yin nature of ghosts. A door god printed in vivid red wasn't just colorful, he was radiating a wall of spiritually hostile light. Historians still argue whether the specific conventions of this fearsome style, the goggle eyes, the fangs, the exaggerated musculature, evolved from indigenous shamanic mask traditions, from the influence of Buddhist temple guardians, the heavenly kings or dvarapalas, or from a slow, cultural distillation of what power looked like on the battlefield and in folk tales. It was likely a simmering stew of all three. The Buddhist guardians, often depicted in a state of furious majesty, bianxing, certainly provided a refined template for combining divine authority with terrifying visage. Local artisans then adapted these models, mixing in the features of local strongmen, legendary beasts, and their own nightmares. So, when you stood before your door, looking up at these glaring, monstrously handsome guardians, you were not meant to feel warm and fuzzy. You were meant to feel a shiver of awe, a palpable sense that this boundary was serious business. The ugliness was a comfort. It was proof that the guardian was not messing around. It was a visual scream into the silent world of spirits. I am uglier, meaner, and more violent than any trouble you're thinking of bringing here. Try me. In a world teeming with unseen threats, that was the most beautiful sight of all. It transformed fear from a passive state of vulnerability into an active, posted sentinel. Your anxiety was given a face, a weapon, and a job, and in doing so, your anxiety itself was exiled to the other side of the door. All that fearsome, colorful paper guarding the nation's doors wouldn't last forever. Sun, rain, wind, and the simple wear of daily life would fade the prints, tear their edges, and dull their intimidating glaze. A weathered door god wasn't just shabby, he was a potential liability. His power was believed to wane as his image degraded, like a battery slowly draining. This is why the door god tradition was never a one-and-done deal. It was woven into the most important cyclical event in Chinese life, the Lunar New Year. The replacement of the door gods wasn't just maintenance, it was an annual ritual of cosmic renewal, a spiritual reset button for the entire household. The mainstream historical anchor here is the New Year festival itself, a time of sweeping away the old, Sishan, both physically and spiritually, to welcome the new. In the days leading up to the new year, a massive domestic cleanup was undertaken. This was the sweeping of the dust, but the dust wasn't just physical grime. It was the accumulated ill fortune, lingering negative energies, and spiritual stagnation of the old year. You cleaned every corner, settled debts, and resolved arguments. The final, most symbolic act of this purge was the removal of the old door gods. You wouldn't just tear them down carelessly. There was a respectful procedure. Using warm water or a wet cloth, you gently soften the paste and peel them away. This act was a formal dismissal, a thank you for a year of service. But you couldn't just throw these retired deities in the trash. That would be deeply disrespectful and potentially dangerous, like discarding a used security badge that still had access codes. The proper, prescribed method was to burn them. In many regions, this wasn't a private backyard affair. Families would take their old door gods, along with other used ritual papers and the effigy of the kitchen god, who had just reported to heaven, to a communal burn point in the village or neighborhood. The smoke, carrying the essence of the old guardians, would rise to the heavens, symbolically returning them to the celestial bureaucracy from whence they came and settling their accounts. In some Daoist-informed traditions, the ashes might then be collected and scattered in a flowing river, completing the cycle of release. It was a dignified, ecological, and spiritually sound retirement plan. With the old guardians ceremoniously sent off, the door frame stood bare, vulnerable, and clean. This was a potent, liminal moment. The house was between protectors. Now came the installation of the new. On New Year's Eve, or the first day of the new year, you'd take your freshly purchased prints. You'd mix a new batch of paste, the smell of the flour and water itself a scent of renewal. Then, with care, you'd apply them. The placement had to be perfect, aligned, symmetrical. As you smoothed the paper from the center outward, pressing out air bubbles, you were not just decorating. You were commissioning a new watch, sealing a new contract for the year ahead. The moment the final edge was pressed down, the spiritual security system went live again, fresh at full power. The vibrant, unblemished colors were a visual shout of defiance to any wandering spirits looking for a tired, on-demand post to exploit. Historians still argue whether this annual renewal was primarily about refreshing magical efficacy or about reinforcing social and family cohesion through shared ritual. The answer is, again, both. The ritual synchronized an entire society. Everyone, from emperor to peasant, was performing the same act at the same time, collectively renewing the protective barrier of the community. It turned a superstition into a social rhythm. It also allowed for change. A family that had a rough year might switch from civil gods to more martial ones. A household with a son taking the imperial exams might upgrade to a pair of illustrious scholar officials. The new year was a chance to reassess your spiritual needs and redeploy your guardians accordingly. So picture the scene on New Year's morning. The house is spotless, filled with the smells of special foods. The sounds of firecrackers pop in the distance, scaring off residual bad luck. And on every door in sight, brilliant, UN-faded door gods stand sentinel, their fierce eyes looking out on a world washed clean. The ritual is complete. The past year, with all its troubles, is literally burned away. The future is guarded by a pristine, powerful, and very attentive set of new hires. The cycle of protection is closed and begun anew, a timeless dance of decay and renewal, of gratitude and fresh hope, pasted onto a wooden door with simple flour and water. As the tradition of door gods solidified, carried on the currents of commerce and printed by the thousand, it didn't just spread, it took root in local soil and grew unique branches. While Qin Shubao and Yuqigong were the nationally recognized brand, China's vast landscape of regional cultures and local histories wasn't content to just use imperial celebrities. They wanted heroes of their own. So, a fascinating process of localization began, where communities adopted, adapted, and outright invented door gods from the raw material of their own pride, their own battles, and their own beloved legends. Your door became a canvas for regional identity. The mainstream historical force behind this was the enduring strength of local cults and folk religion. Official state rituals honored national gods and deified emperors, but the day-to-day spiritual life of people was often tied to local heroes, magistrates who performed miracles, generals who defended the county, virtuous women who became protective spirits after death. These figures were intimately connected to the local landscape. Their stories were about this river, that mountain, the bridge right there. It was a natural progression to promote such a local champion from a village temple to the door of every home in the area, creating a unified community shield with a deeply personal face. Take, for example, the coastal regions of Fujian and Guangdong, historically prone to piracy and typhoons. Here, you might find door gods depicting not traditional generals, but the sea goddess Mazu's fierce celestial commanders, like Qianlian, eyes that see 1,000 miles, and Xuanfinger, ears that hear the wind. Their powers of supernatural surveillance were perfectly suited to guarding against threats from the treacherous sea. In the rugged, mountainous regions of Sichuan, you might find door gods based on the heroes of the Three Kingdoms period who were associated with that area, like Zhong Fei, a general known for his explosive temper and loyalty, a fitting guardian for a tough, independent people. His face, often painted charcoal black with wildly bristling whiskers, was a regional badge of honor. There are stories of villages that adopted a local strongman or a famously honest and brave butcher as their door god after his death, believing his earthy, formidable spirit was perfect for the job. In one recorded legend, a county that suffered from a plague of mischievous river spirits adopted as their door god a former magistrate who had famously tamed the local river through engineering projects and sheer force of will and life. His door god image showed him not with weapons, but with a scroll of irrigation plans. His power was administrative and territorial, perfectly matched to the threat. He wasn't a national figure, he was their guy. This localization created a dazzling variety. A traveler journeying from north to south, from the plains to the hills, would see a changing gallery of guardians on the doors. The styles changed with the local Nianhua printing traditions, the bold blocks of northern prints versus the delicate, almost painterly lines of southern ones. But the faces themselves would change too, telling the story of the region's history, its fears, and its proudest memories. It was a decentralized, organic system of divine defense, where the best candidate for the job was the one who understood the local problems best. Historians still argue whether this regional diversification weakened the cohesion of Chinese cultural symbolism or strengthened it by allowing a core idea to flex and adapt, proving its universal utility. The evidence leans toward the latter. The concept of the door god remained constant, a paired, protective image on a portal. But the content could be customized. This flexibility is likely why the tradition survived so long and spread so far. It wasn't a rigid dogma imposed from the capital, it was a toolkit. A community could take the template and insert their own values, creating a tradition that felt both universally Chinese and intimately theirs. So, your door in a Sichuan village didn't just say protected. It said protected by our hero, who walked these hills and drank from this stream. It connected the safety of your household to the law of the land itself. The national gods like Qin and Yuqi were like the federal troops, reassuring, but distant. The local door god was the neighborhood watch captain, who knew every alley and every troublemaker's name. This deep localism ensured the tradition's heart kept beating with real, lived experience, not just inherited stories. And as this vibrant, localized idea reached the borders of the empire, it faced its next test. Could it travel beyond China itself? Could the concept of the door god become a citizen of other worlds? The door god, an idea born on the Yellow River plains, did not recognize the borders drawn by emperors. Carried by merchants, migrants, diplomats, and the pages of Buddhist sutras, the concept walked out of China and into the cultural landscapes of its neighbors, most notably Korea and Vietnam. But it didn't travel unchanged. It never does. Like a word borrowed from another language, it was adapted to fit new grammatical rules of belief. In these new homes, the door god was asked to report for duty, but had to learn the local chain of command and wear a slightly different uniform. Let's start with Korea during the Goryeo and especially the Joseon dynasties. Here, the mainstream historical context is the profound influence of Chinese Confucian statecraft and cultural models. Korean elites studied Chinese texts, adopted Chinese administrative systems, and with them absorbed Chinese folk practices. The door god, or munsin, made the crossing. You'd see them on palace gates and aristocratic homes, pairs of fierce, armored warriors, often painted directly onto the wooden doors in a style unmistakably derived from Chinese models. They were the guardians of order and authority, a visible sign of a household's participation in a broader, Sinocentric civilized world. But Korea had its own rich tapestry of shamanic belief, a world teeming with nature spirits, household gods, and mischievous ghosts. The Chinese door gods, while respected, were sometimes seen as a bit too formal, too bureaucratic, for dealing with the nitty-gritty of local spirit problems. So they were often integrated into, or even subordinated to, native Korean practices. For instance, before pasting up the munsin prints during the Korean New Year, a family might first perform a gut, a shamanic ritual, to cleanse the house of any lingering spirits. The door god was then installed as a permanent guard to maintain the clean state achieved by the shaman. In some cases, the Chinese generals were even identified with pre-existing Korean protective deities or legendary heroes, blurring their origins into a syncretic local protector. They became part of a layered spiritual ecosystem, not its sole managers. Now cross the mountains into Vietnam. Here, the Chinese influence was even older and deeply layered over indigenous Austroasiatic and Cham cultures. The Vietnamese door god, known as the Mon, or more commonly seen in the form of the two generals Ong Tien and Ong Ac, the good and the evil, or the gentle and the fierce, shows a fascinating adaptation. The basic principle of a paired guardian remained, but the Vietnamese interpretation often emphasized a clearer, almost philosophical duality. One figure would be painted with a kind red or pink face, Ong Tien, the other with a fierce, green or blue face, Ong Ac. They weren't just civil and martial. They were explicit representations of complementary opposing forces: benevolence and severity, mercy and judgment, the capacity to welcome good and expel evil. This distilled the Chinese concept into a more fundamental visual yin-yang. The Vietnamese also excelled in a specific artistic form: woodcut prints from the village of Dong Ho. These prints, made with natural dyes on rustic deep paper, featured door gods with a distinctively Vietnamese folk art aesthetic, less detailed and realistic than Chinese prints, but bursting with bold, symbolic color and rhythmic patterns. They were part of a suite of New Year prints that included pigs, chickens, and scenes of rural life, anchoring the door god firmly within a domestic, agrarian celebration rather than a martial, imperial one. He became less of a soldier and more of a prosperous, sturdy household spirit. Historians still argue whether the transmission of the door god to these regions was a conscious, top-down importation of Chinese high culture by elites, or a slower, grassroots adoption via border communities and folk artists. The evidence points to both happening in waves. Palace doors got the official classical versions first, but the folk versions, carried by prince and storytellers, morphed more freely, blending at the edges with local monster myths and hero tales until their origins became beautifully fuzzy. In Korea, a door god might be offering a nod to a Chinese general while secretly taking orders from a Korean mountain spirit. In Vietnam, he might have the title of a Tang dynasty hero but the cheerful, stylized face of a Dong Ho farmer. This journey tells us something crucial about the door god idea. Its core function was so universally useful, guard this opening, that it proved highly portable. But its meaning was always local. It was a vessel that new cultures could fill with their own fears, their own heroes, their own artistic souls. The guardians, in leaving home, learned to speak new spiritual languages. They proved that the need for a watch threshold was a human constant, but the face of the watchman was a story each community loved to write for itself. Our journey with the guardians has taken us from mythic gates to imperial bedrooms, from woodblocks to foreign shores. But what about now? In the 21st century, in bustling megacities lit by LEDs, where doors are made of steel and secured by electronic keypads, what is the place of a printed, painted warrior from the Tang dynasty? The story of the door god in the modern era is not one of disappearance, but of transformation, a shift from operating system to icon, from a matter of spiritual survival to a powerful symbol of cultural memory, aesthetic charm, and enduring hope. The mainstream historical force that challenged the door god's primary function was, unsurprisingly, modernization and secularization. With the rise of scientific rationalism, especially through the turbulent 20th century, practices deemed superstitious were actively discouraged or suppressed during certain periods. For many urban, educated Chinese, the belief that a paper image could physically repel malicious spirits faded. A deadbolt, a security camera, or a good neighborhood watch program offered a more tangible, reliable sense of security. The door god's literal job description became obsolete for a large segment of the population. He was, in a sense, made redundant by technology and changing worldviews. He didn't get fired. He was promoted to the board of directors as chief cultural officer. The door god transitioned from functional talisman to cultural symbol. You see this everywhere. His image is now a staple of heritage and nostalgia. He appears on restaurant signage to promise an authentic experience, on packaging for premium teas or liquors to evoke tradition and quality, in video games and animated films as a cool, powerful character with deep mythological roots. During the Lunar New Year, you can buy door god stickers made of vinyl or plastic, not to spiritually guard your apartment door, which probably has a number keypad, but to decorate it. They are festive, like Christmas wreaths or Halloween pumpkins. They signal participation in a cultural rhythm, a connection to a shared past. The ritual of putting them up is less about activating a defense grid and more about performing Chineseness, about creating a familiar, traditional atmosphere for the holiday. This symbolic adoption isn't shallow. It speaks to the door god's deep aesthetic and narrative appeal. The bold colors, the dynamic lines, the expressions of fierce dedication, they are simply great art. Contemporary artists reinterpret them, fashion designers weave their patterns into fabrics, and graphic designers borrow their iconic silhouettes. The door god has become a muse. Furthermore, in an age of anxiety, even if we don't believe in ghosts, the psychological comfort they represent, the idea of a dedicated protector, of a boundary honored, is still profoundly attractive. Pasting one up can be a mindful act of setting intention for the new year. This home is a place of safety and good fortune. The mechanism has changed from magic to metaphor, but the desired outcome feels strangely similar. Historians and cultural critics still argue whether this transformation into pure symbolism represents a loss of authentic folk belief or a natural, healthy evolution that allows a tradition to survive in a changed world. Is a door god on a Starbucks cup a celebration of culture or a dilution of it? The debate is lively. But the sheer persistence of the image suggests its power runs deeper than literal superstition. It taps into archetypes: the guardian, the protector, the unwavering sentinel. These are roles that never go out of style, even if we now outsource them to alarm companies and insurance policies. So, walk through a modern Asian city at New Year. Amidst the glass and steel, you'll still see them. Not on every door, but on many. On the gate of an old-style tea house, on the red-painted doors of a rebuilt temple, on the apartment door of a grandmother who insists on the old ways, and on the dorm room door of a university student who just thinks they look awesome and remind her of home. They are no longer uniformed officers on active patrol. They are retired veterans, wearing their medals, invited to every parade because we still honor what they stood for. They remind us of a time when the world was animated by different kinds of forces, when security was painted on with paste and faith, and the line between home and the unknown was guarded by a story given a face. And in a world that can still feel chaotic and unprotected, that story, and that face, retain a whisper of their old power, not to bar ghosts, but to comfort the living. So here we are, at the end of our watch. We've stood with cosmic guards at the ghost gate and with sleepless generals in palace halls. We've felt the texture of cheap, vibrant paper under our thumbs and smelled the sharp scent of fresh paste on a New Year's morning. We've seen how a single, primal human need, to feel safe behind a thin line of wood, spun out into 1,000 stories, 1,000 faces, a tradition that could flex to fit a village hero or a foreign shore. The door god's tale is, in its winding way, the tale of civilization itself. The endless, creative project of building mental walls against the chaos, of personifying our fears so we can negotiate with them, of finding in art and story a shield sturdy enough to let us sleep at night. The journey from peachwood charms to digital stickers is not a story of decline, but of incredible adaptation. It shows how a practice can hold its core shape, a protective image on a portal, while its substance flows from magic, to memory, to metaphor. The mainstream historical truth we're left with is that cultural traditions are not fossils, they are rivers. They change course, absorb new streams, and sometimes run underground for a while, but they keep flowing, fed by the deep springs of human need. The door god survived the end of empires, the rise of science, and the noise of modernity not because everyone still believed in his supernatural job description, but because the role he filled, the guardian of the threshold, is a permanent vacancy in the human psyche. There are those who whisper that the old magic isn't entirely gone. That in the quiet moments, when the electric hum of the city fades and you're alone in the dark of your own home, the ancient instincts stir. That the act of choosing an image, of placing it with care on your door, however modern that door may be, is itself a tiny ritual. And rituals, however small, have power. They focus intention. They mark a boundary in the mind. So perhaps, in a way the most skeptical historian might grudgingly allow, the door god still works. Not by physically barring demonic entities, but by helping you bar the door against anxiety, against the creeping sense of vulnerability that is the modern world's most common ghost. When you look at that familiar face on your door, you are, for a heartbeat, connecting with every ancestor who ever did the same. You are asserting, in a silent, stubborn, beautiful way, that this space is yours, and it is guarded. That, it turns out, was always the real magic. Historians will, of course, still argue. They will debate sources, dates, the precise moment Zhong Kuei entered the canon, the economic impact of the Nianhua trade. But some arguments, perhaps, are best left unresolved, humming in the background like the distant, comforting rumor of a watchman's footsteps in the night. The evidence is no longer just in tombs and texts, it's in the continued, stubborn presence of a smile at the sight of a gaudy print on a grandparent's door, in the warm weight of a tradition passed down not as doctrine, but as a story of how we once, and in some ways still, keep the night at bay. So, as you lie in your own bed tonight, in your own century, with your own locks and alarms, take a last look at the door to your room. See it not just as wood and metal, but as a threshold. For thousands of years, across this vast civilization, people believed that threshold was worth guarding with the most powerful forces they could imagine. The authority of myth, the loyalty of heroes, the fury of the wronged, the balance of opposites. They gave those forces a face, and pasted it up with flour and water. They turned their fear into a sentinel, and in doing so, made their world, and their rest, a little more secure. That act of imaginative courage is their legacy. It's a story that ends, as all good bedtime stories should, with the assurance that the door is watched, the night is kept at bay, and you, for now, are safe. Let the images fade now, the fierce paint softening into gentle watercolors in your mind's eye. The shouts of the generals mellow into a distant, rhythmic murmur, like wind sighing through an ancient peach orchard. Feel the weight of the centuries we've drifted through settle softly around you, not as a burden, but as a heavy, comfortable quilt of stories. The ghosts are quiet. The guardians have taken their posts, their watch transferred from paper and legend to the quiet, steady beat of your own heart. There is a profound peace in knowing that you are the latest link in this endless chain of watchfulness, that the simple, human need for a safe threshold connects you to mud brick huts and imperial palaces alike. Your breath is the only sound in the room now, a soft tide marking the boundary between today and tomorrow. All the frantic energy of history, the wars, the innovations, the fears, has distilled, in this moment, into this single, tranquil point. You, in your bed, behind your own door. So let go of the narratives, the debates, the colorful prints. Let them dissolve back into the dark from which they came, their duty done for tonight. They have given you their gift, the deep, slow realization that security is, and always has been, a story we tell ourselves. And tonight, your story is one of stillness. The world outside is vast and old, but here, in this room, all is quiet. The guardians are on duty, in whatever form you choose to imagine them. There is nothing more to do, nothing more to watch for. Allow your eyes to grow heavy, your thoughts to blur at the edges like ink on old paper. The night is deep, the threshold is held, and you are already dreaming.